To give some perspective about the 1950s compared to 2018, I remember I was born in Manhattan, New York, and the way it was then was they used to use coal for heat. And in these apartment buildings, they would give delivery of coal, and you would have a chute that went into the basement. At night during the winter when it was freezing, the landlord was able to cut off the heat legally from like 11 p.m. at night or whatever to 6 in the morning. And when got up and you were going to school, you heard everybody banging the pipes. They took like a hammer or a pair of pliers or whatever, and they were banging on the pipes. And throughout the building, you heard people banging on the pipes. In those days, there was no washing machine where in our apartment. My mother used a scrub board. She would take the clothes into the bathtub and a shirt or pants or whatever. She would use what they call a scrub board or a ripple board. It was a frame that had like a rippling metal looked like little waves of the ocean, metal that kind of like went up and down, and you would run the clothes over this and press down with your body weight, and then after you felt you got it clean, you would hang it up on a line. We used an ice box, and let's say this was 1950, 52. I was a little kid at the time. And with the ice box, you get a delivery of ice like 3 weeks, 3 times a week, and you would have this big tongs that would grab this big piece of ice, and you would carry the ice up the stairs. We had like 3 flights of stairs, and they considered me too young, so my older brother would usually get the ice, and he'd bring it up with tongs, and then he'd have to return the tongs to the Iceman, because the Iceman came around for everybody. You really didn't have electric refrigerators down. If you wanted to go to the dentist, you went to the local boys club, where I described on one other tape that they tied you down, your arms down with straps, and put a strap around your chest, and they would put a strap around your forehead, and there would be like a neck piece in the chair. And I described it that Brunhilde would hold you down. When you went to school, you shared a seat with somebody else, cheek to cheek. They would have half the seat, you would have the other half the seat. And there were like 60 kids in a class, and they didn't really teach anybody anything. All the teacher did was try to keep people in their seats. I went through the 3rd grade without knowing how to read or write. It was that kind of a place, and yet they passed me. So, but actually they didn't teach. They just told you, made sure you sit in your seat. Like I said, there were probably 60 or 70 kids in one classroom. And that's how it was in 1950. If you went to a dentist, there was no Novocaine, there was no water drill. They just held you down, and you kind of bit the bullet. You didn't have any fast drills. And at that time, if you went to a doctor, it was really mostly about his opinion. They just had urine tests and blood tests and straight x-rays at the time, but there was no MRIs or CAT scans or ultrasounds, no fancy equipment to figure out, what was wrong with somebody. I remember my uncle, he had a lot of stomach problems in about 1960, and he did exploratory surgery, because without the elaborate equipment we have today, the only way you could take a look is to cut somebody open. Now we look at today. Well, of course, too, we had phones in the 50s that you had to click the receiver, and the operator would kind of plug you in on her switchboard, and you'd have to give the number. There was no rotary dial even at the time. And of course, it was a hardwired phone. It wasn't a cell phone or anything like that. And there were phone booths, but they would have like a clicker, and you'd have to put money in it. They really didn't have a dial. The rotary dial came out later. And in the homes, they had party lines. You'd lift the phone, and if somebody was on the phone, you put the phone down until nobody was on the phone, and then you were able to use the clicker to get the operator and tell her the number, and she would connect you. Today, of course, we have the cell phones, we have the computers, we have the ATMs. People buy things online, they bank online. You go to the supermarket, there's a UPC code. In the past, people used to, even if they operated a cash register, they would have to make change in their mind and count the change back to somebody. And they'd have to take a physical inventory. And today with the UPC codes, retailing has changed because they just go click, 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 and they need so many fewer cashiers. And of course, you have emails, and you have the cell phone and texting and so forth. In those days, it's snail mail, and you put a stamp on an envelope, and you go to the post office, and nobody had phones on them. There were phone booths. Everything was slow and harder. People would type in typing machines, and they would have carbon paper to make a copy. There was no such thing as a fax machine, and all of that. Really, the technology with the ATMs and the UPC codes, and cut back on bankers and cashiers, and it became a totally different world. Today you buy things online, and you can call somebody all over the world with a telephone. They have Skype where you can see who you're talking to on a phone. And cell phones are really more available. It's no big deal to make a long-distance call. In the old world, a long-distance call cost you extra money. You'd have to maybe even go to a phone booth and start putting like $4 worth of coins in, even though $4 was expensive, particularly 40 years ago or whatever. It was a lot of money. It was like $25 or $30 now. Probably buying power. But this is how the world has changed. And all this diagnostic equipment in the hospitals have really made healthcare and diagnosing healthcare really more of a precision art. There's no such thing as exploratory surgery anymore. And thank God they save all these people's lives. They have new chemotherapy and whatever. Years ago, if somebody had cancer, it was like a death sentence to people. And people are living longer. In the 1900s, people only lived to 40 years old. In the 1960s, late 50s, 60s, they were lucky to get out of their 60s. That most people never saw 70. And you'd wind up in a nursing home. But with all the new blood pressures and blood pills and blood pressure medicines, people are living longer. They're able to treat diabetes better, and a lot of diagnostic things, and life expectancy has changed. And it's this is what the world is in 2018 and the early 2000s, and you don't see telephone booths anymore. People that were born in the year 2000 and up never saw a telephone booth. There was no such thing. It's all cell phones and technology and computers and buying online and ATMs and emails and so forth. This is how the world changed. If people were born 50 years ago and they got transported to now, they would think that we had a war with Mars and that we lost the war. because years ago it would flash good, and he would have a little wristwatch, and he'd be able to talk to somebody a short distance away, which would be more like a walkie-talkie. And that was a futuristic thing when I was a little kid in the early 50s. And people thought that would be amazing. So this is the world of tomorrow today.